northbound. Making a bit to the west.
Con el sudeste asiático. Otra nación latinoamericana, Colombia, se le concedió el mismo estatus. Ahora mencionaremos los actos violentos que se han sucedido en Colombia. El 12 de septiembre, el presidente de
The groundnut seedlings bowed in the dry wind, mirroring and multiplying Miel's body as she bent to weed. In the next row, garlic and oca stood shaded by the lines of maize, sheltered in kind by palms and the sombrero-like canopies of walnut trees. The agroforest had taken half a decade to establish. Stood apart from the walnut trees was another plant, only its branches were of metal and uniform, arranged in a star-like pattern. Reaching 5 meters into the air, it glowed faintly in the evening light. Its cables twisted around a rusted base. Building this radio antenna had been Miel's first commitment to making this land her home. She had found the sculpture design in an old cookbook for radio equipment. It impressed Miel to read that the author, Margareta Darcy, was the founder of Radio Pirate Woman, a feminist group in Galway, Ireland. Darcy had devised recipes for making antennas out of household objects, such as coat hangers and cooking utensils. Doing so negated the need to buy equipment that would have brought the activities of Radio Pirate Woman to the attention of the British government. Learning about the Irish women's resistance and craft fueled Miel's desire to become a proficient radio operator.
Okay, so we just received, and you just heard, an extract from the speculative feminist story, When I Image the Earth, I Imagine Another. The story was written by us, Open Weather, and illustrated by the Iranian visual artist Golrokh Nafizi. In the feminist tradition of speculative storytelling, it probes the possibilities of an amateur network of satellite ground station operators in a not too distant future.
So in resonance with the speculative world in this story, last year on the 31st of October, the first day of the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow, Open Weather led a network of people operating DIY satellite ground stations around the world to capture a collective snapshot of the Earth and its weather systems, and nowcast for an undecided future. Tuning to transmissions from 3 orbiting satellites owned by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, the volunteers collected imagery and submitted field notes from their different geographical locations. In field notes written on the day, contributors described their experience of the weather while receiving their satellite image. They described the unusual dry winds over the Parana River in Argentina, the heavy rain of a cyclonic weather system curling around the UK, and the increasing amounts of dust in the air in Mumbai. They also responded to the question, where do you locate climate change in your community or your environment? Combined, these images, data, and field notes generated a feminist and fractal image of the Earth, and a record of conditions of climate crisis from Bangkok to Kinshasa to London.
Okay, so in this talk, and actually, I just want to say, because we added at the beginning, it's semi-scripted, and if you'd like to follow along using text, there's an online version here, and the tiny URL is tinyurl.com/, open-weather-SA.
Yeah. Thanks, Sophie.
You're welcome. Okay, so in this talk, in which we use fiction to narrate the present and explore the present as its own fiction, we will unpack with you this planetary event that Sasha was just describing, the nowcast. We will also think together about the possibilities, imaginaries, and stakes of a network of amateur satellite ground station operators spread across different locations and linked through the invisible mediums of radio, friendship, and collaboration. In doing so, we want to draw on tools and ideas from intersectional feminists that have guided how we work, but also the questions that we ask. We will also tell stories of DIY radio experiments on balconies and wetlands in our own backyards. As Open Weather, we ask together, what does it mean to collectively image the Earth and in doing so, reimagine it? Sasha, would you like to introduce Open Weather?
Yes, I'd love to. So Open Weather is a feminist experiment in imaging and imagining the Earth and its weather systems using DIY radio tools, led by myself and Sophie. But Open Weather is also actually around 80 other people around the world, which we hope to give you a sense of today. Sophie is an investigative researcher, designer of archives, and also my best friend. Sophie and I met in a pub after a talk at Goldsmiths University, and I had asked her what she was doing in her MA. And she said that she was working on volunteer-run Wi-Fi networks in Calais.
This is Sasha, and she's a creative geographer, diviner of patterns in radio interference, and also my close friend. And when I met Sasha in the backyard, or the back of the pub, she said she had just received her amateur radio license, and this really impressed me. And we made plans to meet up in her backyard to test her new antenna.
So since we began presenting the project and running workshops, we try to begin with the declaration of friendship. And this is because friendship is a core ingredient of the project. It really shapes what we choose to work on, how we work, and at what pace or rhythm.
So Open Weather emerged 5 years ago from our combined effort to learn how to capture and decode satellite transmissions and so images. Over many months, in fact years, I'd say, we read blog posts, we deep dived into member-only forums, and we watched countless online videos to understand how to combine off-the-shelf DIY equipment that is low cost with free and open source software. Our first performance that you can see here, Open Work Second Body, was a live stream of us during the first lockdown, reaching from our balconies in London to capture and decode an image from the satellite NOAA 18. In collaboration with the Yorkshire-based author Daisy Hilliard, we also thought about the very specific and unsettled weather of the pandemic. So when Sasha and I talk about weather, we include in that conversation the more than meteorological weather. For example, atmospheres of unrest, or perhaps political climates. We also acknowledge that weather holds time. As philosopher Denise Vieira da Silva writes, in the very heat of the air that is driving ever stranger weather, there is the direct manifestation of the racialized and capitalist expropriation of lands, goods, people, and labor over the past few centuries. So when I walk through my neighborhood on an unseasonably hot day, I am not just breathing the effects of an urban heat island. I am also breathing an atmosphere that is the result of 400 years of colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism.
Now, performances and artworks are one part of Open Weather. However, the project is also committed to pedagogy and building shared practices around the work. So the other aspects of the project are how-to guides and workshops. We co-wrote our own DIY satellite ground station guide aimed at people with no background in radio or science, and published it on the community science platform Public Lab. We were surprised and excited to see that in the first months after it was published, people were using the guide to set up their own DIY satellite ground stations in places like Buenos Aires, Seattle, and Mumbai. We also began to lead DIY satellite ground station workshops in which we work with a small group of people to learn how to capture satellite images using free or inexpensive amateur radio tools, and to think critically about radio and Earth images from feminist perspectives. Indeed, one of these workshops, the 7th in the series, happened yesterday here in Amsterdam. So we want to give a shout out to everybody who participated because it was amazing.
And also say that it's also 8 hours long, like Mary Magic's workshop, so we're quite tired.
It ended at 9:30 at night, so we're a bit still coming out of that moment. But also just quickly on this image is from the workshop, but you see one of the raw images from satellites on your right-hand side. And just to point out that this image was taken at night, so it's mainly including infrared data from Earth's surface. But you'll see it has these kinds of like lines and notches around the sides. And those notches you can see in the white bar running down the middle, each notch corresponds to 1 minute. So the satellite is not actually taking a snapshot of the Earth, it's scanning the Earth line by line. So each line in this image has a different timestamp. And the image itself was about like 10 or 11 minutes long. So we're talking about images that are not kind of snapshots of time, but kind of durations of time. Okay, and then so through the responses to our how-to guides and workshops, we began to see and imagine a growing meshwork of people around the world collecting and sharing satellite imagery and notes on weather. The formation of this meshwork and the building of infrastructures to support it is the speculative fiction we are exploring with you here today.
So, what's at stake in open weather, and specifically the meshwork of DIY ground station operators that Sasha just mentioned? First, our work exists in a context, a very specific context. Capturing images from NOAA satellites is part of a long history of radio amateur practice, which traditionally was limited to small groups of people. These were people who had the means to buy often expensive equipment, space for so-called radio shacks, and were often, as a consequence, white, male, and at ease with the technical language. That said, we are not the only artists working with radio amateur tools and knowledge. Artists and scholars Aphrodite, Sarah, Audrey Briot, Jin Liu, and Adriana Knopf have also captured images from the same NOAA satellites and used these as materials in installations, performances, and sculptures. So while our work exists in this ecology of practices, we want to raise specific and perhaps a different set of questions and concerns. 3 of these we will share with you here today. The first is how we image and so attempt to reimagine our world. In other words, our insistence on a partial and weathered worldview. We encounter satellite images every day through the weather apps on our phones and products such as Google Earth. In Sonic Acts, I remember that in 2017, New York-based artist and writer Ingrid Burrington called Google Earth Forever Noon on a Cloudless Day, in reference to the techniques of atmospheric correction that are used to create the composite satellite image base map that is stripped of cloud cover, always sunlit, never in shadow. These images inform how we imagine the Earth, and yet their aesthetic grammar is so narrow. They reproduce a vision of the planet that is smooth, whole, and completely captured. As I think it was perhaps Mary Magic, who just also quoted Donna Haraway and said, in the so-called God trick, the camera and so us are positioned directly above. At stake for us in open weather and in choosing to work with satellite imagery is an alternative set of visual strategies for imaging and so imagining our world. The patchwork nowcasts that were imaged by many people and stitched together by us are in many ways counter images to Google Earth. They are partial, they are interference prone, and they are clouded by multiple weathers.
So our second key concern is inclusivity and access to amateur practices of satellite imagery reception. As Sophie was saying earlier, imaging the Earth using radio is a practice typically known within very narrow circles and demographics. In these circles, people tend to be interested in collecting the longest, most pristine, noise-free image with the best antenna. We want to know what kinds of images would other people make? What questions would others ask from different positions and places? So our guides and workshops are specifically about generating accessible and inclusive spaces for those who have been historically distanced from amateur radio and satellite imagery reception. Our third concern is an alternative way of responding to the climate crisis. So satellite imagery is one of the dominant currencies of knowledge in our time of climate crisis, and is also often used to demonstrate authority. In open weather, we ask, how might a different approach to satellite imagery, one informed by knowledges outside of academic science and expert practice, enlarge alternative ways to respond to our environments and to each other across spaces and scales? Relatedly, how might privileging other kinds of information beyond images, so from field notes to the local context to the movements of bodies, provide ways of knowing and sensing the climate crisis beyond the visual?
Okay, so now you're looking at a website. You're looking at the COP26 nowcast. And what I want to talk about next is how these concerns and questions play out in the work, very concretely, and in particular how they play out in the COP26 nowcast. So last year we invited everyone who we had made contact with through the how-to guides and through the workshops, as well as a handful of contributors to whom we posted the antenna kits, to capture a satellite image on the first day of COP26. We also asked participants to respond to 2 questions about their experience of the weather on the ground and how, if at all, they located the climate crisis in their community or environment. Over the course of October 31st, the first day of COP, 40 images from 29 ground stations were submitted to the Open Weather Archive, from London to Japan, to Kinshasa in the Congo, and Newcastle in Australia. And with our longtime collaborators, who unfortunately aren't here today, but shout out to Lizzie Malcolm and Dan Powers, done a lot of teaching in the Netherlands, in order the Studio Rectangle, we developed a process to batch decode, process and georeference these individual snapshots. We then map them onto an equal Earth projection. The resulting nowcast, as we call it, is a jagged array of images and field notes, interspersed with empty spaces where no member of the network was present.
So one way to describe this image would be to call it polyperspectival, an image of a single Earth or world from multiple perspectives. Indeed, this is how we originally conceptualized the visual grammar of the nowcast in a public talk hosted by the Photographers Gallery in London the day after the nowcast was launched. In reflecting on the work since, however, we feel that a grammar of fractals is better suited to this Earth image. Because whereas a theory of multiple perspectives quietly upholds an underlying unity or whole, fractals better communicate what Gayatri Spivak calls planetarity, the expression of difference without undoing the possibility of interconnection. In other words, we want to hold on to the fact that each contributor to the nowcast has a different ontological position, which means a different way of being in relation to the Earth and the climate crisis. They are not just seeing or witnessing Earth from different angles, they're also living and weathering it in fundamentally different ways. So fractal composition of the nowcast becomes evident when reading the field notes. A contributor calling themselves Barfrost near the cartographic North Pole in Kirkenes, Norway, reported the fact that southern insects are now surviving the winter. Cedric Chimbalanga, an artist in Kinshasa in the Congo, noted the way the sun dominates in a lengthening dry season. And Tasha Honey, a farmer in New South Wales, responded that she lives the climate crisis through the decisions she makes about what and when to plant. These are not three perspectives on a single warming planet. They are three people performing different modes of being and existing through the climate crisis.
So there are multiple ways in which experience is written into the images and data, very literally. Each image carries the traces of the location of the ground station operator. In Stuttgart, the movement of Yasmin Schadler's body as she tracks the path of the satellite through an already noisy radio environment is written into the image as an interference pattern. And I should say that you really have to physically track, like I was doing earlier.
Yeah.
In Mumbai, India, Ankit Sharma's images are too textured and cut short by radio frequency interference in buildings. From the balcony of his apartment block, Ankit collects 3 images while lamenting the gathering dust that threatens his laptop. Pattern of cloud is the beauty of nature, writes Yoshi Matsuka in Japan. His quadrifilar helix antenna is photographed framed by a cloud. Unlike other contributors who came to satellite imagery reception through open weather, Yoshi has been receiving NOAA weather satellites for decades since he was a student. Zach Vetstein, an emergency department doctor in Seattle on the Pacific West Coast, writes, I see the impact of climate change reverberating in my community and environment. I see patients affected by these hazards who present with injuries, illness, and exacerbations of their underlying disease. In the first nowcast, which he ran in 2020, the year before, Zach could quite literally see in his image the wildfire smoke that he was treating in the lungs of his patients.
The nowcast demonstrates, too, how weather and climate are felt and witnessed in complex ways. So how climate might be sensed as immediately as weather, and how knowledge of weather transcends both spatial and temporal scales. Artist and curator Alison Scott was standing in a park on the south side of Glasgow holding a turnstile antenna to the sky in the midst of heavy rain. To keep her laptop dry, she had fashioned a shelter from a set of umbrellas. In this uncomfortable and very wet position, she heard the sound of the satellite transmission coming through the static through the cloud. Multiple scales intersect here. Alison collects an image of a cyclonic weather system taken from 1,000 kilometers above, while she's thoroughly immersed, exposed, and sheltering from this same weather system. Alison's descriptions of the climate crisis in Glasgow have a similar material and temporal immediacy. Like weather, they are happening right now. She says climate change is felt in a lack of public transport resilience, in bike lanes being opened and closed, in the neglect of public space and the diminishment of green space, in the corporate hijacking of COP26 and the city's unpreparedness for its scale, in the erosion of rogue landlorded sandstone tenement buildings in need of retrofitting. In Argentina, cartographer and marine technician Joaquín Escura and Amy Yuhas are in the Parque Nacional Ciervo de los Pantanos. They describe a day of unexpected low temperatures after the arrival of the cold sudestada wind, and add that indigenous communities living in the delta of the Parana River are suffering dearly from both low levels of water and increasing numbers of fires during the winter dry season. Joaquin and Amy remind us how climatic and weather conditions register in the livelihoods of communities with a specific historical relations to land. In this way, they gesture to the sovereignty of weather. This means honoring the weather as more than our immediate conditions or an object of measurement. It is history's, life worlds, and relations too.
Dusk had rolled into a light, polluted night. Miel lifted a laptop from her rucksack. Searching through the grass, she found the braided cable of the antenna. Miel attached the cable to a USB stick that she plugged into her laptop. A few lines of code launched a program from the early 2000s, and the radio spectrum began pouring down her laptop screen in a colorful waterfall. She turned the volume up and listened. The evening cicadas were replaced by the radiophonic chirrups of 1- and 2-hop whistlers of faraway electrical storms. Miel loved this slice of the radio spectrum. In the early days of wireless communication, 7 MHz was one of the first bands allocated to amateur radio operators. Waves in this band reach 43 meters from peak to peak. At sunset and sunrise, these waves traverse continents and oceans, skipping between ground and sky. Sensitive to electromagnetic perturbations, they also ride the ionized tails of meteors. Although amateur use of the band had waned, Miel felt a rush of anticipation as she scanned the spectrum. Lulled by an ocean of static, Miel was startled by a burst of noise. The disturbance left an orange streak on the otherwise blue waterfall display. She zoomed in, selected the frequency, adjusted the bandwidth, and listened.
Okay, so we just received again, and you just heard, the second extract of When I Image the Earth, I Imagine Another. I'm going to tell you what happens next, but I'm not going to tell you the ending because it is in the Sonic Axe magazine. So, in the story, Miel meets another radio amateur and elder, Ray. Out of Miel and Ray's friendship and the need to track the formation of a bomb cyclone over the Pacific, a meshwork of radio amateurs, signal decoders, and weather watchers grows. By tuning to the transmissions of a zombie satellite, the meshwork broadcasts the sound of the storm as it swells and creeps towards Ray's home in Australia.
And this is where open weather and fiction meet. So looking forward in 2023, Open Weather is building a real-time weather map powered by an ever-growing network of DIY satellite ground station operators. We've also recently launched an open-source decoder of satellite images that will feed into this real-time weather map. We understand, after Nerea Calvillo, hey Nerea, we love your work, that sensing as monitoring is not enough. This is why we are open-sourcing our workshop guide so that it can be adapted and used without us. We are also self-publishing the second edition of the Open Weather Feminist Handbook that documents the protocols that inform how we work and the questions we ask.
Building the meshwork and its real-time weather map is an act of science fiction because, to paraphrase the organizer Adrienne Marie Brown, it involves conjuring worlds that do not yet exist. Our work is speculative, but in a feminist mode, it is also committed to thinking with and from experience, and critically, it is an invitation to activate the possible over the probable.
More than hardware and code, the open weather meshwork is built of social relations, imaginaries, and divergent futures. Thank you. Okay, so we have a couple notes of thanks. We want to thank Olivia Berkovitz for being our voice from the future, Teresa Koss for mixing and editing the sound. Thank you, Teresa.
Thanks, Teresa. Thank you, Sonic Acts, of course, for having us. Thank you, Mirna Belina, for the invitation. And thank you to Rosa, and sorry, Rosa, I'm going to mispronounce your surname, Dunstein, and to everybody who helped facilitate yesterday's workshop.
And thank you to Michela Trovato and Zarina Akbar for all the support in getting us here to Sonic Acts.